Hello, hello, welcome back, and today I've got a further guest, and that is Kathy Cashman, Professor Kathy Cashman from Bristol University, formerly Oregon, and we had a really intriguing dinner conversation last night, and I wanted to ask you a few questions about that for the students and our audience here. Well, welcome Kathy, first of all.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Doug, yes. We talked about black swan events last night, things that we are not familiar with. And you've just been to a workshop in Singapore, you said, where this was a big topic.
Yeah.
Would you like to tell us a little more about this?
Certainly. So the concept of a black swan is that Europeans have only white swans. And so traditionally, Europeans assumed that all swans were white. And then, of course, they started going to other parts of the world, and black swans are quite common in other parts of the world. So the concept of a black swan it's an event or something that from one person's perspective is impossible to imagine, but is actually well within the realm of possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And that the idea of black swans, actually, I'm going to use my crib sheet here, is...
Fair enough.
No, so I wanted to get the title and name right. So there's a book about this called The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and that's sort of the textbook for this.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to get that correct.
Very good.
But what he talks about is black swans in our everyday experience. And so an example, I'm clearly American, and an example is the events of September 11th, 2001. And so from clearly the perspective of Osama bin Laden and that group, they were planning it. It was an entirely probable event. From the perspective of even people in the intelligence in the US, it was within the realm of possibility, but seems so unlikely that no one really took it seriously. And so if people had taken it seriously, his point is, there are plenty of things you can do to counter against it.
Mm-hmm.
And we could have prevented it. But because we couldn't imagine it, then we can't do anything about it.
We didn't prepare.
We didn't prepare.
Yes.
And this, it goes into all sorts of different fields and how this is important, but it's become of interest to volcanologists because on the one hand, we know intellectually that we've had very, very large eruptions in the past,
Mm-hmm.
but we haven't witnessed them. And so often there's a challenge, whether it's with volcanoes or earthquakes, that you usually want to plan for what you think is the sort of worst probable, not the worst possible. And usually that's good, because you don't want to waste a lot of resources on these very unlikely events. But the idea is that as humans, we're not good about thinking of that extreme tail. And so we get caught off guard. And so that and we're evolutionarily developed not to be able to imagine that extreme tail. And so I'm not doing the book justice because I haven't finished reading it yet. But it's very intriguing, and one of the counterintuitive things that he talks about is actually the more information you have, in some ways, the worse off you are, because you think you have a good sense of what the possible is.
Yes, you get confident, potentially even
Right.
overconfident, and
Right.
just from my lectures, I have this example that I always share with the students, which is the 1902 eruption of Pelé. If you look at the newspaper reports at the time, they were communicated by telegraph. The paintings or the drawings that were done in Europe, they show lava flows, while what really happened is there was a pyroclastic flow, and it was only a few months after the eruption, after the main eruption, that Lacroix went to Saint-Pierre, and he actually saw a small pyroclastic flow, and then it became clear to the scientific community that this was a rather different animal to what people had actually imagined. So I see the problem there, because if you don't know, if you cannot imagine something, and if you have no experience with it, you really have very little means to prepare. So what is the answer to this?
Well, the workshop that I went to was on something that was related, and we actually had a lot of discussion about whether you could call it a black swan because we're trying to imagine it.
I see.
But it's the idea of what's called counterfactual analysis. This is used a lot in history, and it's like, what if Hitler were never born? Yeah. So you can go back in the past and query history and look for how much single events seem to have changed the course of things.
It's a fascinating mental
which
game.
Which seems like a mental game, which is what I had thought. But what the workshop was about, and it was not just volcanologists, but it was people in other areas of risk, is that as volcanologists, when a volcano becomes restless, then it's a big challenge to try to imagine what the spectrum of possible activity could be.
Right.
And so we usually go out in the field and see what the volcano has done before. But volcanoes don't always do the same thing.
No.
And so then, of course, we can also use our broad knowledge of what a volcano has done. But the difficult part is imagining sort of these low probability, high impact scenarios. And what I've now realized from this workshop, or what we were doing as an exercise, is thinking not just about the event itself in terms of physically what happened during the eruption, but what other small things could have gone differently that would have made it a lot worse. And this is called a downward counterfactual, and apparently another natural part of human nature is that we look back at an event. First of all, we assume that it was predetermined to happen that way. And then we're usually saying, well, what could I have done better? What would have made that event? If only I'd done this, then
yes,
this would have been
we have
better.
This in,
we're
all the time. Yes,
and that's called an upward counterfactual.
I see. Okay.
But the exercise we were doing to try to understand this sort of long tail on the probability is what's called the downward counterfactual. And so I was telling Val last night, an example is from my own experience, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens.
Right, I remember, yeah.
Which was an unusual event, and in some ways was a black swan event, in that the magma was coming up into the volcano, and it actually pushed the north flank of the volcano north by about 50 meters. And this was a huge amount. And then that flank collapsed, and there was a blast that went laterally to the north before we had an upward directed plume.
Yes, I remember.
So there was huge damage to the north. And that was in some ways an example of a black swan, because people knew that this could happen. It was mentioned or discussed as a worst case scenario, but it wasn't planned for. And in hindsight, looking at it, what we realized is the symptoms of this type of activity were you ended up with a horseshoe-shaped amphitheater, and then something called the debris avalanche that had all these funny hummocks and a very distinctive morphology in the field. And as soon as people saw that, I remember seeing this and saying, oh, that's like those funny lahar mounds around Ruapehu, where people said, oh, that's what that strange stuff is around Mount Shasta. And so volcanologists all over the world were then looking and saying, oh, okay, this happens commonly.
Horseshoe and boulders and bumpy terrain.
But because it hadn't been actually witnessed and put together. So in that way it was a black swan, and in that way a lot of people have said, oh, it was a worst case scenario. We were unlucky, we got the worst case scenario. But you can, if you want to try to think in a downward counterfactual way, then what Gordon Wu, who works in catastrophic risks, likes to call the counterfactual game, you take that and you say, okay, how could it have been 5% worse?
I see.
And to give you some background, the eruption occurred at 8:32 in the morning on a beautiful, calm, sunny morning in May. And in fact, it had been so calm, the volcano had been so calm over the week or so before, that there was real pressure by homeowners who mostly owned vacation homes. And they'd been excluded, and they wanted to get back into their houses. And so the county sheriffs had organized, and they said, we'll lead you in. I don't know what they were supposed to do, but
maybe just pick up stuff. But
yeah. I mean, but why the county sheriffs?
Oh,
But anyway, so the homeowners were lined up, ready to come into the area. And if the eruption had been even 2 hours later, there would have been a lot more people in the area and a lot more fatalities.
Wow.
So that's one. It's called a small delta that has a large impact. It was a Sunday, and on weekdays there were still logging going on in the area. So there would have been loggers around, and in fact a lot of the logging equipment was taken out by mud flows. So if it had been on a Monday through Friday, there would have been a lot more people in the area. As it turns out, the wind was blowing from west to east, which is actually fairly common, but doesn't happen all the time. And so it was unfortunate for the people in eastern Washington and Idaho, but there's a relatively low population density there. Whereas if the wind had been blowing north, it would have gone right over Seattle, which is a very large city. If it had been blowing south, it would have gone over Portland. So again, just a simple change in wind direction would have had a much larger impact.
It almost sounds as if we were all really lucky about it. So, wow.
And, the weather was good. If the weather had been bad, then you can imagine, first of all, you would have had a lot more trouble of raining ash, and wet ash is much heavier on roofs than dry ash.
Yes, absolutely,
so you get more roof collapse. But also the rescue operations would have been more difficult, because they did get people in, and they managed to get people from the sort of outside of the blast zone. So
wow.
So, and that's just, off the top of my head, some things. Another thing, if the eruption had been a little bit larger, there were mud flows that went down the Toutle River into the Cowlitz, and they made it just to the Columbia River. Not far down the Columbia River was an operating nuclear power station.
Whoa. Now
They
we're
didn't
talking
quite
not just
make it
5%. It's getting quite serious now.
Right. So it's just an exercise, but it has already made me think differently about how you assess risk. We're so focused on event trees about what the volcano is going to do, but actually these other situations like wind directions or the occupation of a certain area as
even
a function,
human action, indeed.
human action
Yes,
as a
yes.
function of time of day, time of the week, time of year, that these are all things we know. And so you can start to do what's called Bayesian analysis and put in probability distributions and run simulations and actually factor those into your risk assessment. And it's not something we typically do, but that's
Yes.
what became very clear to me at this workshop, and what some people are starting to think about is how can we actually use this, because some of the probabilities we can't quantify, but there are a lot that we can. As I say, like weather data, we have lots of history on it.
I can see how this exercise will actually help you identifying some potentially common issues that we need to learn to avoid in order to make things not worse. We want to kind of reduce the impact on the population, and this is interesting. The example I mentioned earlier, the Pelé situation in 1902, I realize now that you say it that there was of course also a human problem, and I was wondering, there was also a human problem in the sense that there was an election, and people tried to avoid evacuation because they needed voters in the city. And this probably made the situation a lot worse, and we need to learn about that. Our actions can actually make a natural event into disaster. It is our issue, because nature will do its thing, but it's I guess ourselves, we are putting ourselves in harm's way with these things.
Well, just to tell another story from 1902, and actually one of the points of this workshop that this catastrophe specialist was trying to get us to think about is he said, you know, it's great if you can do things and model them, but actually just going back and re-examining past events and doing this sort of exercise actually broadens your thinking. And so it's important to do even if it's just a thought experiment and not quantifiable.
But I can see that if you were to analyze a number of eruptions this way, you would likely find certain common patterns about what human behavior, what behaviors actually increase the risk. And this, I think, is the big lesson here, isn't it?
So an interesting story that we still don't know much about, but in 1902, about 4 months after the eruption that you're talking about, there was a very large eruption, actually the second largest eruption in the 20th century, in Guatemala, of a volcano called Santa Maria, which probably most people have not heard of.
I actually have, but
volcanologists have. But the interesting thing about this, first of all, there was a very large earthquake under it in April, and the people in the area were feeling earthquakes. So in a modern sense, there would have been warning.
Yes.
So people knew there was something going on. But that's not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part of the story is that, so the eruption happened, and we know very little about the fatalities, but even as volcanologists, we actually know very little about the eruption. And we started looking into it. I was working with a historian of Latin America and then a master's student who's fluent in Spanish. And we sent her to look at newspapers. So she went to Guatemala City and looked through the entire set of local newspapers from 1902. And she said that April earthquake, and Santa Maria is actually quite a ways northwest of Guatemala City. In fact, it's quite close to the Mexican border. But there was a large population center there, Quetzaltenango. She said, yeah, you know that earthquake? Really well covered in the Guatemala City newspaper. There was lots of information about it. That area was important because it was big coffee plantations. So it was
I didn't know about that aspect, but it kind of makes sense. Yeah.
So very well reported. And so I said, okay, so what about the eruption? The eruption was October 24th. She said in the Guatemala City paper, October 24th, nothing. October 25th, nothing. Nothing for a week. And then after a week, you might have heard this eruption. No, it actually occurred in Mexico. We don't have a volcano problem in Guatemala. And meanwhile, we know that hundreds were killed. We think that it's probably more like thousands. People are fleeing into Mexico, and so there are reports from the Mexican newspapers and then from the American newspapers as people are moving north, saying there's been this huge eruption. It's had all these fatalities, this big impact. The ash went northwest, so it went both north in Guatemala and then into Mexico.
Right.
And so there's all this reporting from there, and Guatemala City's nothing. Well, it turns out that October 24th was the start of a week-long festival of progress that had been started by the fairly new president / dictator. And it's very clear he didn't want his festival being interrupted by this.
It's a bad omen, probably even. Yes.
Bad omen. A lot of the people who were killed were natives, not the Spanish, because it's a large native population. And what becomes more interesting is then the reports in the newspaper. Now I'm putting it in my words, but he starts to say, all those reports you hear about this big eruption and stuff, it's fake news.
So,
and
from 1902, okay.
Meanwhile, the newspaper in San Francisco starts saying that Guatemala has cut off all media access. They've basically put up a media barrier, and they can't get any information. So we actually realized that probably one of the reasons we know so little about the eruption is that it's a human and political
It's a
problem.
human thing,
It's exactly
exactly, yeah.
it's exactly the same thing. Didn't want the bad news, and particularly didn't want bad news because of the coffee plantations, and were worried about the coffee price. Of course, a couple of years later, the coffee was doing great because volcanic
All
ash
the
is
ash,
actually
yeah.
quite good.
Absolutely.
But it's sort of another viewpoint of this, of the issue of control of information, and what people are willing or not willing to believe. Because obviously, if you don't have experience with this, then you're like, oh yeah, it probably is fake news. You know?
So just to kind of round this off, what is it we can do in order to get better in being ready for black swan events?
Well, you know, that's a little difficult because obviously
I
it's
realize
a black swan, you can't
exactly,
get ready for it.
so.
But the discussion in this workshop was how can we start to use these types of analysis of past eruptions to think more broadly about how small changes could have large impacts. And an example, a sort of concrete modeling example, is one that two people who worked on this, Willie Aspinall and Gordon Wu, just recently published.
Okay.
And it's related to the eruptions of Super Hills volcano in Montserrat.
Right.
And there, actually, I was on the scientific advisory committee with Willie, and Montserrat is still sort of, it's not really a colony of the UK, but still sort of under the UK.
Yes.
So there's a British governor, and there's the local government. It was a very small island. It has a slave history. It's a very complex situation.
Mm-hmm.
But there was, the British government assembled a scientific advisory committee to come in every 6 months and try to update the hazard assessment. And the local government had very specific things they wanted in terms of where people could live, where people could work, what had to be evacuated. So this was an analysis that was done, actually I think it's still going on, even though the volcano's quieted down. And there we did something called expert elicitation, which is you take a group of experts and you weight their answers in an interesting way, which we could talk about. But to try to get a group assessment of what probabilities are for different types of events. And the most difficult thing we all found were trying to assess what the probability specifically of a smaller eruption progressing into a larger eruption. That was the concern. That was a low probability event, but it was very hard to know what that probability was. And so they've done sort of a counterfactual analysis, but in a modeling exercise, of taking a very simple model for what the conduit was like, and in terms of geometry, and they know a range of volumes that came out, and just saying, well, if you take a distribution of volumes and a distribution of conduit geometries, what's the probability that you have a large enough volume and a conduit geometry that it would actually get into the magma chamber, assuming then it's going to turn into a big eruption. And so you can do that with Bayesian probability monitoring to actually, it's a simple model, it's not perfect, but it gives you a little bit better assessment. So that's one example. Another example from Montserrat is something that there's a volcanologist who's always been one of my heroes, Frank Parrott, I think is how he pronounced his name. He was at Mont Pelée, he was at Vesuvius, and he was in the Caribbean in the 1930s when Montserrat had a seismic swarm that went on for 3 or 4 years. And in fact, it had a seismic swarm in the 1890s, in the 1930s, in the 1960s, and then in the 1990s when it finally turned into an eruption. And Parrott recognized, just from a seismic perspective, and he actually wrote that there's been these 2 or 3 years of earthquakes, and he said if they had all happened as a single event, it would have been a very large earthquake. And so we're lucky that it was released gradually. And that's counterfactual thinking.
Yes, you would, and
Yep,
of course,
yep.
thinking of
Thinking.
I see.
So
it,
so he's seeing that possibility, and then Gordon Wu did an interesting analysis and said, okay, in the 1990s you have this unrest.
Mm-hmm.
People are trying to think, well, what's the probability it's going to turn into an eruption? One way to look at it is saying, well, the volcano hasn't erupted since 1630, and that gives you sort of, it only erupts every 400 years, and so there's this probability of 300 whatever. But he said, if you know, which they did, that there were seismic swarms in the 1890s, the 1930s, the 1960s, and if you say, well, each seismic swarm had maybe 20% chance of turning into eruption, then from a statistical point of view, then the seismic swarm in the 1990s has a much higher probability, or you calculate a higher probability.
That makes sense, yes.
And so that another thing that we talked about quite a bit is that as volcanologists, we don't have a good understanding of non-eruptive periods of unrest. And actually that's really critical information.
I agree with you, actually. No, this is fascinating. Wow, I realize we have a lot to learn, but I also realize you certainly better start. So,
well, not me. I'm just learning from
you're involved and you're sharing it here.
Masters.
So, but nevertheless, I'm really fascinated by this, and these gaps in our mind, they are a big challenge for the future. Well, I think we all got a good impression of this now, so I'd like to thank you again, Kathy, for sharing all your knowledge with us and your experience from the recent workshop. And well, hopefully we can do another interview in a few years and see how this kind
well,
of
I just challenge
forward.
everyone to do counterfactual games in your own life, because
I will start that now. So.
and this idea of thinking not always, I could have done that better, but how could things could have been worse.
That's right.
And it also makes you a more optimistic person.
It makes you actually feel better as well. You have a better outlook on the future. So wonderful. So thank you, and I say goodbye to our audience, and bye-bye. I hope to see you next time, and thanks, Kathy, for sharing all this with us.